Hey Masters, welcome back to JoanMedia. It's a pleasure today to have Mark Noonan in the channel. As you can see in his Twitter profile, he's a web developer while a senior engineer, and also you can see that he works at Cypress.
We're going to talk about is like making a new component and the component test that goes with it, and then testing that component like in its use in a parent, and then talking about the end-to-end test version of this and how we might sort of use the component test to help write the end-to-end test if we're able to find our way through, and really show what it is when you have component tests and end-to-end tests in the same framework. We'll also take a look at this project here, and this is where we're going to do all of our work anyway. We'll take a look at the sort of end-to-end testing and sort of page object model stuff that's in here. It's similar, I guess, to page object models, but it's not exactly the same. I just want to show that because this is a demonstration of like deeply integrated component and end-to-end tests. It's not something you would do full bore like this in real life, but I wanted to show what's possible at least, because there's some things that might make sense to translate. So let's get started. Let's make a new component, and what we're going to do today is make a happy button component. I'm going to come into our view project here that has everything in it, and we're just going to make a new file called happybutton.view, and it will have nothing in it to start with. So what I'm going to do now that I've made that under SRC, we have Cypress running, so I'm just going to focus the browser and create a new spec. And I'm going to use create from component to do that, and we have happybutton.view here under SRC. So great, we've made a sibling component to this SRC happy button. We've made a sibling file called happybutton.js. So this, as we can see, is some test code that's importing and mounting the components. So let's demonstrate what that's actually doing. We can run this, close up the little spec explorer there. So we've successfully imported and mounted a component, even though there's no actual code in the file. What this is really confirming is that a file exists here. So very basic, exactly what we need to start off with, successfully importing a component, and we can verify if we did try to change that to be something that didn't exist, Cypress would fail. So we've gotten the basic conditions for a passing test. I'm going to make one change here, which is I'm going to change this to JSX. It's JS by default, but in this project I have JSX set up, so I can do this a little bit more readably. I think this is easier to read here. We're just going to mount it that way. We've changed something in here. Yeah, we've changed the extension. Okay, cool. So Cypress can't find it, and that's fine because we're yelling because there's no file at this path anymore. That makes sense. But we can search, and I have Cypress really big so we can see it. But yeah, we can search here and get back to our spec. Okay, so we've decided this is called happy button, and to me what that means is we're going to show some text with a smiley face when you pass in text to the button. And we want to start this out in the most basic way possible. So we're going to sort of do test-driven development and say like what we wish it was doing. So initially, I just want to get the next increment of this done, and I want to say sci.contains button for the selector, and I'm going to say hi with a big old smiley face after it. That this is the string we want the button to contain. So we'll save that. And we'll look at our test. It's going to rerun, and it's going to figure out that this component is not behaving that way. So I'll make one more change here. I just want to mess with the viewport a little bit so it gets kind of easier to see, because this is not going to be a very big component. So I'm going to say height 100, viewport width, I don't know, 250. Cool, component test rerun. That looks like just a better area. Alright, so now that we have this in here, let's go back to our component code, and we're going to make it have something in it. So to begin with, it needs a template element being a view component, and we're going to put in a button with no text to start out with. And we're getting an accessibility warning here about buttons having no text. That's really good, but we can see that there's something in here now. If I put the content in here, hi, and we get our smiley face. Now we've got a passing test. So this is the core of making the component do what we want it to do. But we've tested the user-facing output of this. So if you're familiar with Cypress, the site contains is just a DOM assertion. It's nothing to do with the component. Everything below the mount is all just Cypress testing you would do in E2E. Same kind of user-facing stuff. There's a developer-facing part of this component, though. We want it to accept a prop that will tell us what text is going to render, and then we want to assert that we've actually seen that same text so that we know the component can be used elsewhere to make a happy button with any text content. So I'll start by adding a prop here, and we'll say hi. And this test is going to still pass because the component technically is still doing what it was doing. So it is helpful to make a couple of tests that mount with different props. We won't do that right now, but that's the kind of thing you would do. You would assert a mount with a different prop and get a different output. So for now, we need to actually add the prop behavior though. So I'm going to change our asserted text here to something that's not in the hard-coded component. And so this is kind of what we would expect. If we put in hello, we would get hello with a space and a smiley face in it. And our test is failing now because that's not what it finds. It finds hi. So to make that prop work, let's just do that in view here. We'll add a little script section, and we're gonna say, let's take a look at another component real quick to look at, yeah, it's the export default. And for this, we'll just say props text string. And so now I've got a prop defined in here, and I'm going to say do this to it, right? We'll say text. And if I come back here, we're passing all of a sudden. So it runs the test really fast because it doesn't have to mount your whole application. I mean, it doesn't have to visit your whole application that's running and let its render happen and let it fetch its data and then finally render a page and get to a state where this button exists. It's just like, okay, we start, we mount, we test. It's really fast. This also means I can turn down the timeout, right, in these types of tests. So let's say I fail this. I changed this to have a 1000 millisecond timeout because there's no network involved. I'm not concerned in my component tests about waiting 4 seconds for the page to maybe settle or things like that. If it's going to fail, it's going to fail quickly. So having a faster timeout is a nice benefit of component tests. That's why in general you can get faster feedback from them on failures as well as on things passing. So we've tested this component here, and I would just point out that in this test, this is the only place that I ever want to care about happybutton.view as a file name. That's an internal concern. The name that we will put here, like rendering it, we don't care about that anywhere else. The name of a prop, no other test will care about this. The only thing we might do in other tests is use, this check of the output to make sure that we're getting what the component's responsible for. But no other test at any level is going to care about this site.contain stuff. I mean, this mount stuff. So something like site.contains will be represented in another test. So let's use this component. I want to pick something else to test. Let's try the hello intro. So this appears on the home page. That's this stuff here. So we have a component spec for that, and we're going to look at it. We're going to add an assertion to it. So let's open it up. Cool. And so I'm going to say that this should have some responsibility beyond just rendering the button, right? It has to give it some text. So we're going to do site.contains in this test button. And we'll say welcome is what we expect. And we still want the smiley face, still want it to be a happy button, but we don't care about the existence of the component or not. So let's first see this, and we'll see it's failing. That's good, that's what we want. You can also see there's a bunch of other assertions up here that we're going to talk about in a minute using this custom command in this project called sci.validate. I want to loop back to that at the end, but really what we're doing is we're just going to say sci contains button welcome. In fact, we can even skip that. Great. And so in order to achieve that button, we can come through to where this component exists and we can do two things. So of course we can hard code a button in there. Great, we've got a passing test, we've got a welcome button, but that's not the idea. The idea is that this button would be more special, have special styling or something like that, so we would want it to work in a different way. So we'll strike that, and we'll import the button that we made, which was called, happy button. Great. We'll add it to the list of components declared in here, and then we will use it in our template. And I'm actually going to make it self-closing, because why not? And pass in some text. And initially, let's just put the text in wrong. Okay, great. This component is failing at its responsibility, right? Because we have this spec here that says it should be this behavior. So that's great. We know the test is checking the right thing. And I'm going to change this text to welcome. And the important thing is this looks the same as it did when we hard-coded it, and this test is passing the same as it did when it was hard-coded, because this test knows nothing about this child's component's name or even that it exists. So I think that's an important distinction of a component test of the component itself versus being in a parent that happens to use children or grandchildren or whatever that do something, right? At that point, we don't care anymore. So this is it. This is the use in a parent. And now I think we should switch to end-to-end and look at testing this in a page and maybe how the component test could help us even to write those types of tests. So we'll come back out to end-to-end here. And there are a couple of end-to-end specs in here. We're actually going to make a new one, but let's just look at this is the one that's running for the home page. It's doing all kinds of stuff that we'll look at later. That was quick, but there's a ton of assertions happening about this page. The only thing we don't have is a spec that does anything with this new button we just made. So I'm going to make an empty spec. We'll call it example. And it's going to do the same thing it did for the component test, right? Cypress is making a spec file for us, this time at the appropriate place of the E2E example area in our E2E folder instead of in the SRC folder with our components. And we'll just run the spec here. So it's refreshed Cypress because it's going to a different domain because it's got a visit command in it. So the visit command is to the example Cypress website, but we don't really want that. We want to go here. And so that slash is going to come with the local host attached to it. And I would like to just make sure we're all familiar with this type of config in Cypress, where we set a base URL. And so we have clearly set the base URL here, and that means that in our test we can just visit slash, and it comes after this. And then this takes us to our place. So this is the app that we have running. And we can see this button is here because it's part of that hello intro component that we're using. And I want to take first the naive approach to writing something that tests this. So let's say there's a couple of different things we want to do here. And we'll use Studio, which is an experimental feature in Cypress, but works pretty well. So I'm going to do one or two things here, right? Let's check the H1. I'm going to make an assertion that it should have this text in here. That makes sense. And then we're going to check the button. And we're going to say it should also have the text in here. And perhaps we'll click it. And we'll save. So we've made a little mini E2E test that waits for the loading spinner to time out, right? We have this pretending to load state. Then it loads, and then we check all these things. So everything is good. Now let's go back into this example here. This is probably familiar if you've used recorder type tools before. There's a sort of built-in weakness where we have a really reasonable thing that you would write yourself for the get.h1. This is not something I would rewrite. Sci.contained is slightly shorter than this, but this is very common to see. In the meantime, though, we have these two that have this data v attribute. And that's something that's added by the framework. It's not something we really care about. And the need for it is not really clear, but something like Cypress Studio might pick this because this is unique and this identifies the component uniquely or the button uniquely, and so it becomes part of this selector, and that's something we wouldn't want to do. So the reason to not do this is these change all the time. As you make a new build, you get some new numbers in there, and your tests that used to pass are failing because of this irrelevant thing that changed. And so the type of thing you could do with an example like this is you can think, okay, well, every element in the page is part of a component system, and the components should be tested, which means every element on the page, especially all the interactive elements, should have already been reached in a component test by the time you're writing an end-to-end test. So if you know enough to fish around and find the component spec that applies, you can see, well, how did the developer who wrote the component spec target this? And you can go, oh, it's just a side that contains with this text. There could be like a data attribute in here that we care about, like data size something or whatever. But in reality, we can use sci.contains here, and we can change our expectation of what shows up to target it there, and then we can move our click around. And so this is only like necessary if a tool gives you things that are needing manual changes. But if you're separated from the team that's doing the component testing work, you can still look at their component tests if they're written in Cypress and understand what those locators are and verify that they're there. And if they're not there, if you hit an interactive element that belongs to a component and has no component test, that's a problem that could be reported and communicated back to that team, because you probably want the feedback for the developer if they remove that important element that's in an end-to-end test. You want them to find that out when they work on the component. So let's save that, and we've made it a little shorter, a little more readable by having the selector that came from it. We've also extended it by clicking, and if there was some side effect on this page, we could see that effect as well. So this example is like the simplified version of what we might do when we get into a component spec. There's another thing we can do, right? So this is very direct copy and paste to share the code and sort of be inspired by tests written for components, because you can lift them directly for an end-to-end test. But the other way to think about this is that as component tests are being written, they are actually potential fragments of end-to-end tests, and you can pull them out into shared helper functions. These end up looking a little bit like page objects, but still sort of different. So I wanted to show this example here of this project, talk a little bit about what this project is. This is the standard Vue CLI scaffolded project with some additions. We have a router, we have a little bit of interactivity, just so there's more here to test. You can log in and do some stuff like that. And as we saw earlier, there's a spec here for the home page that has a lot of assertions in it. So we can look through this end-to-end test that's going like really exhaustively. We're going to get every link and make sure it has the right href and make sure the href is in the right format. And you can also see some stuff logged in here that's not typical Cypress logging, and that's added by some custom commands that I wrote for this project. And you can see some withins and get components that's also not normal Cypress stuff. So we have another aspect to this, which is we can modify the playground. You can see where it says data sci component hello world. This one says data sci component hello intro, because that's the component that owns this. And so when we think about that, in this project, there's some other stuff that's set up to allow this, right? So it's not a Cypress feature to have this component level stuff, but the reason to do it is because this end-to-end test for the home page, for example, is driven by these validator functions. And the code under this is just a custom command in the project called site.validate that I've added. We have some code here to add the custom command and deal with some options and sort of handle exactly what we should do in here, right? And this is not important. You wouldn't have to do this in your project. But then what it means is we can have this long test that has like almost 400 lines of output. And really it's just validate, and pass a little bit of like parameters here and there. Like, oh, we expect a message in this situation. So when we go right up to the top here, on this first test, we're going to use that contains to make an assertion about what happens when you try to pass a query param up here. And so it is a function that has some parameters basically, and we can pass those in to get it to work. And what it's doing is reusing all of the client-side, like user-facing code that was written for component tests. So if we look at the validators in here and take a quick look at the smallest one, hello list item, right, is the smallest thing that you could possibly have in here. So hello list item is validated with this little test content. And when we look at the validator code, it's just poorly organized. But let's find hello list item. So cool, we can like do something in here that's pretty nerdy about making sure it's an li element because it's supposed to be a list item, right, for accessibility. And we can have some conditional logic about whether it's been told to be active or not. Active comes out of this test data thing that we just saw. And so then we know that in this case, the hello list item is supposed to have a link inside of the li. And so we have a little check that there's a link, that the link is working, and that we have the right href, and the href is in the correct format. So there's actually a lot of things being checked about a relatively simple component. And this is all the code that we might write in the hello list item test itself. We could write that in here instead of calling validate. And then we're using it again and again in the same thing, right, to have different test data to call the same tests on it. And this is pretty small, but you can see how it adds up, because now in a higher level component test of the list, for example, we can call the validator for hello list. And if we were to look inside our validators file, we would see that hello list, the component validator, is validating the hello list children behavior, like the list item behavior, and so on. And so we have a end-to-end test that's entirely created from the user-facing parts of component tests. The part of this that I, wouldn't do all the time is be so concerned with what are the children and what the component is made of, but it's a useful way sometimes to organize a component test. The place where I would think this is most valuable is if you have something complicated like a calendar, like date picker thing, or you have something like a sortable table that you have to test, and components are already written to do that work, and they have component tests. So you might be able to look at the component test for a sortable table that's checking it in isolation with mock data, and you could probably extract that complicated set of tests to be run on an end-to-end basis, so that you visit a page that's supposed to have a table in it. It's using real data from the API. It's a true end-to-end test. But now you want to exercise that table the same way the component spec does. And you could probably extract that into shared code that takes like the data as a parameter, so you don't have to rewrite an entire long complicated test script just to do the same thing that already needed to be done in a component test. The reason to have both in the first place is the developer editing the table should get really fast feedback when they work on the table components and the components inside the table. That developer should get really fast feedback as they do that on their local machine in an isolated fashion to find out if they're breaking functionality or not as they work on the table. Whereas in the end-to-end test, we do want to test the same things, but we might be able to reuse what's in the component test and also perhaps test less. Our end-to-end tests will be more horizontal. We might do partial checks of the table to ensure certain important features are always working, but we might not test every edge case, every scenario. The component tests can easily and quickly fill that table up with all different kinds of data without any trouble whatsoever, versus the end-to-end test will be slower, a little more expensive to do the same thing because you're loading an entire page, waiting for it to load, making sure we get to the right state for the table. The end-to-end test probably doesn't need to be as exhaustive as a component test. So that's kind of the stuff I wanted to cover. The validator pattern is sort of silly in this example for sure. We don't need to go to this extreme, but like I said, every now and then it might be useful, and it's an opportunity that you have when your tests are stacked with end-to-end and component testing in the same framework. It's very difficult to do something like this without having harmony between the languages and the component tests and the end-to-end tests. So yeah, hopefully this has been useful.